The big question at play at the moment in geopolitics is whether the BRICS can serve as a counterweight to Western institutions. So far, the one equation that was holding BRICS back was the chill in India-China ties, which now seems to have thawed a bit as a result of the India-China bilateral, and also the fact that there is disengagement happening along the line of actual control between the People's Liberation Army and the Indian Army. What does this mean for the global high table and the manner in which it could potentially get remade? Joining us to talk about this is somebody who has a good understanding of everything that's going on in the global south, former president of the United Nations Security Council, one of Asia's best-known diplomats, Kishore Mahbubani, now joins us from Singapore. Mr. Mahbubani, welcome and thank you for your time. So far, BRICS was seen as a non-cohesive, non-aligned grouping of countries which couldn't come together with a defined agenda. Do you think with ties between India and China now showing a thaw, BRICS could really be coming of age, that this Kazan summit chaired by Russia is really the one opportunity where BRICS emerges as a genuine counterweight to the Bretton Woods institutions created after the Second World War?
Yeah, well, there's absolutely no question that this meeting between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a very big deal, okay? This is what they call one of those earth-shaking moments where history turns. Because at the end of the day, if China and India don't get along in the 21st century, we won't have the Asian century. But if China and India they will not become good friends, by the way. But if they can get along and work with each other on their common global interests, then I think it changes the course of world history. And certainly one of them clearly is the fact that power is shifting from the West to the global South. This is inevitable. The West makes up 12% of the world's population. The West make up 88% of the world's population. So it's quite natural for the 88% to become more assertive in their demands. And so BRICS clearly is one of the vehicles that is used by the global South to express its views. And clearly, with China and India coming together, the weight of BRICS is going to be heavier. And here, as an aside, you know, when you try to figure out what really happened behind the scenes, I sometimes wonder whether chance events like what happened between Canada and India may have been a kind of a sort of an influencing factor, because it's a reminder that India also needs to develop lots of options.
So let's take it one by one. You've said a lot which needs to be unpacked. You're calling this a significant history-turning moment. That's big and momentous. The biggest question in India, Mr. Mahbubani, is can the dragon be trusted? You know, the PLA came in unannounced, uninvited, building up positions along the line of actual control in territory India considered part of its own area, borders which were disputed, which were patrolled by both countries, and they came and they positioned themselves. Then that's where they've been for 4.5 years. Now, as unexplained as was their ingress, is their exit? The biggest question is, how do we know that this disengagement is lasting? It is a genuine pivotal moment, as you're suggesting, and it's not just tactical, because China at this moment faces internal challenges of its own. Unemployment, a slowing economy, a real estate bubble, a stimulus which isn't been quite as dramatic as China would have expected, or Xi Jinping would have expected. So he has internal challenges. So how does India and the Indian people, the Indian government, the Indian army, can they trust China?
Well, you know, Rahul, I've studied geopolitics for over 50 years. And the biggest lesson I've learned is that countries should not base their relationships with each other on trust. The only thing that matters at the end of the day is national interest. I think, as you know, Lord Palmerston said so. And at the end of the day, it's not trust that will bring together China and India. It's a convergence of interests on both the sides. And you're right, by the way, that China is having certainly some short-term difficulties with its economy, and certainly you'll be looking for options. But it's also important to bear in mind, Rahul, that when you deal with China, unlike the United States, which is thinking about the next week, next year, maybe next 4 years, the Chinese are always thinking 10, 20 years ahead and what kind of world is emerging over the next 10 to 20 years. And clearly, the Chinese still believe that time is on their side. Over time, the economy will grow slowly, but it continue growing. And as you know, it is already the world's #1 manufacturing power. And indeed, that's where there might be a convergence of interest between India and China, because India has a tremendous potential to emerge as a manufacturing power. But to do that, you need components, you need technology, you need investments. And it's good to have as many sources as possible, including China. So I would say at the end of the day, relations between China and India will be determined not by trust, but by convergence of interests. Of course, by the same time, you do need to have, and this is having been a diplomat for 33 years, you need to have a certain degree of a personal relationship. Again, not trust, but an understanding of each other. And that's what this meeting will be good for.
No, but we've been down that road earlier at Mahabalipuram, at Xi'an in China, on the riverbank of the Sabarmati. I was in Xi'an. The optics were fantastic. But then with China, we've seen personal diplomacy doesn't work. If that is what mattered, then when Prime Minister Modi and President Xi were walking along those lovely temple ruins in Xi'an or at Mahabalipuram or in Xi'an, it wouldn't have been followed by the Galwan clashes. And that's really the problem here, because you have a better understanding of the Chinese mind. You have multiple off-record conversations with people in China who don't typically speak outside the mainland. What's your understanding of why they've now agreed to this disengagement, and from what I've heard from the foreign minister, to going back to the pre-Galwan 2020 status quo ante, which was so far what India was asking for the last 4.5 years, and China wasn't agreeing. So if it does pan out in the way that is being suggested by leaders in both Beijing and Delhi, then what has changed now for China to accept to do something which they were refusing to do for 4.5 years?
Well, by the way, for a start, let me just emphasize that lots of leaders have falling out and then they get together again. As you know, President Joe Biden came into office saying that Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia is a pariah. I have nothing to do with him. And you know what? President Joe Biden went to Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, among leaders, it's not the personal relationships that matter. It's the overall interests that always are the defining factor. And here, by the way, I'm very happy to hear that we are going back. Both China and India have gone back to where they were before Galwan. And I think it's very important to establish the basis on which now things can move forward. But as you know, there are solutions to border problems. At the end of the day, China and India are very large countries. They're not small countries. And the amount of territory involved, if you leave aside Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin, which, as you know, are two separate issues, the issues at contention on the border are not significant. And by and large, most countries find ways and means of compromising. Russia and China, as you know, had very difficult relations for a long time. The Soviet Union came close to attacking China in 1969 over the border issue, but then they settled. They gave in, they both sides settled. China and Vietnam, as you know, have had a very difficult relationship. In fact, for over 2,000 years, and Vietnam occupied by China for 1,000 years. And guess what? They also settled the border. So there are ways and means of settling these things with a certain degree of understanding on both sides. And at the end of the day, in geopolitics, when two great powers meet, they must look at the global picture. And as part of the global picture, one element is the border. It's very significant, but it's not the only element. Now, I'll give you another example. Let's say a major war breaks out, right, between Israel and Iran, and oil prices shoot through the roof. You know which two economies are going to be hurt the most? China and India. They're both net oil importers. They're not exporters. The United States will benefit, by the way. The United States is net oil exporter.
No, so let's spend some time on President Putin's agenda. One of the big things that President Putin is putting front and center of the BRICS agenda is trying to smash the monopoly of the US dollar. The de-dollarizing global trade and global finance is clearly an important part of Vladimir Putin's agenda. China wants it as well. The one currency at this moment which has the potential of being an alternative, even though there aren't free capital flows and China has a lot of restrictions on how the yuan moves globally, but is the renminbi. Now, why would a country like India accept having the yuan as an alternate to the dollar? That's like putting your heart or your money in the hands of a country you simply cannot trust. So a lot of the BRICS agenda, Ambassador Mahbubani, is such that at some level, okay, so you can thaw the ice, but can there be this bare, warm hug like you would have between Prime Minister Modi and Vladimir Putin, which is on our screen right now, even between Biden and Prime Minister Modi, Putin or Harris, whoever, with China? The equation is frankly quite different, sir.
By the way, de-dollarization is not going to happen anytime soon. You know, in my book, Has China Won?, I explain at great length, you know, the US dollar is unshakable. Its dominance will be around for a long time. You know, even after the US economy eventually becomes the number 2 economy, the US dollar will still remain the global reserve currency of the world. Its depth and power, especially in financial markets, is irreplaceable. So I think all the world leaders understand that. But what does bring them together at the same time is they want to lower their vulnerability to unilateral actions by the United States against them. And I can tell you that after the West seized the assets of Russia, this created lots of concerns, even among friends of the United States, including Saudi Arabia. UAE will begin to wonder, oh, hang on a second, are these dollars mine or do they belong to the United States? So, by the way, the role of the United States is going to remain incredibly powerful. I mean, the United States actually, it's quite amazing. While Europe has declined significantly in its share of global GDP, the United States share has remained constant or increased. It's a remarkable economy. So you must never, I think China or Russia or anybody else cannot underestimate the United States.
Sure. So one last question. You mentioned the deterioration in ties between India and Canada and the recent frostiness we've seen between Delhi and DC on account of these countries patronizing Khalistani terrorists. You see that as being an important reason why China has agreed to rearrange the decks along the line of actual control and why this thaw has actually emerged at Kazan?
No, I frankly, I don't know. I cannot, let me not pretend that I know what the internal considerations were. But again, in geopolitics, everything works quite logically. They're like billiard balls. They're very logical. If you shoot the billiard ball in a certain direction at a certain trajectory, you can anticipate how the other ball will move. In the same way, geopolitics is like billiard balls. So if you know, Canada, as you know, I mean, I'm going to be very diplomatic about this, okay? Is very sensitive to American interests. They would never have arrested the Chinese national if Washington, D.C. hadn't told Canada, you better go ahead and arrest this Chinese national. Sure. So Canada is very, very sensitive. So I'm very puzzled that Canada is taking such a strong line against a good friend of the United States. So I kept asking myself, what's going on here? What's the signal? And so it is quite logical, therefore, for India to make also a logical conclusion and say, okay, there may be a signal. I need to also increase my options too. So I think in that sense, these are like moves on a chessboard. And sometimes you can anticipate if someone moves the bishop in a certain direction, then you move the knight in a different direction. You can anticipate these moves.
Kishore Mahbubani, you've always been an original thinker with fresh insights, and in the course of this conversation, you've given our viewers a lot to mull over. I thank you for taking out time and joining us from Singapore. Appreciate this, Ambassador Mahbubani.
Thank you for having me.